Good morning and welcome to the Journal Star podcast. I'm Chris Kaergard. Joining me today is State Representative Jehan Gordon-Booth, Assistant Majority Leader in the House, and one of the four architects behind the legislation that just passed the House that, starting in January 2020, will legalize adult use marijuana in Illinois. Jehan, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Now, I want to talk about some of the elements in this bill that are really critical to Peoria and to some communities of need.
Yes.
That you worked hard on getting into that legislation. One of the key pieces of that is a reinvestment program, the R3 program, that's going to spend a quarter of the tax revenue on communities that have been hard hit by the war on drugs. Explain what that program is.
So when I think about when approaching the issue of legalization of cannabis, I think that oftentimes when people think about this issue, they just think about it from the perspective of people just having the ability to partake in the usage of THC products. I look at cannabis, the legalization of cannabis, not just from that perspective, but but really much more so from the perspective of what we have the ability to do around criminal justice reform, equity, and community reinvestment. And so specifically what you speak of as it relates to the R3 program, the Recover, Restore, Renew, R3, the objective is to do exactly what you said. It's to take 25% of the tax split with the legalization of cannabis and reinvest those resources back into communities that have been divested in, communities that have been ignored for the last 80 years during this war on drugs. And so we could not have a real conversation about the legalization of cannabis without talking about the very real harm that's been done in communities across this state. And when you look at how you rebuild communities, obviously it's going to require a plan. That plan should be localized to that specific community, but those resources have to be significant and they have to be concentrated around key areas of need within that community. And so with this program, what we're doing is we're taking these proceeds and we're putting them, we are doubling down on our investments in divested communities, Black communities, brown communities, low-income communities that have that are in dire need of support. They need to know that government sees what they're dealing with and what they are managing, which is why that was a very key component of this bill to me, and why I'm incredibly proud that we were able to get that as one of the cornerstones of this important, not just legalization legislation, but equity legislation.
And what we're talking about there is addressing not just problems of violence, but of unemployment, of reduced housing stock,
legal aid issues, community development, economic development. And so the reason why this is incredibly important is because in a mature market, we'll have a mature market in 3 to 5 years. In a mature market, the R3 program will be reinvesting around $125 million every year. We should let that sit.
It's continuous throughout the process.
Absolutely. Let that sit for a moment. Above and beyond the other resources that we are sending to communities, we are additionally adding another $125 million to those key specific areas that we know that our communities lack right now. And so, again, that component of the bill is critical. So what we're going to do is there'll be a board that will come together this summer. And that board that will be chaired by Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. Within 60 days, they're then going to draw what the R3 communities will look like. We think it's important that we have a very important equity and justice lens, because those communities are going to be the communities that are going to be the recipients of said resources. Also within 60 days, there will be another board that is composed. So the first iteration of that board is like most boards, you'll have appointees from the governor, the speaker, the minority leader, the Senate, the House minority leader, the Senate minority leader, Senate president, et cetera. So that's what your typical boards look like. But the second iteration of that board, which will be composed 60 days later, that does not look like your typical board.
Okay.
Those folks will be man formerly incarcerated from the ages of 22 to 35, woman formerly incarcerated.
So people who have experienced this and know from going back into the communities what's needed there.
Absolutely. So the goal was to make this as community and as people-centric as possible, and to make sure that the folks on the ground that know the issues in communities have the ability to not just have a voice because they have maybe their Facebook page or their whatever their social media platform of their liking, but will actually have a voice at the table, helping to make the decisions as it relates to where these resources are going to go. I think that that's critical, that's pivotal, and I've never seen that during my time in the legislature.
It's really very different.
It is. It's different in a good way.
Yeah.
Right? It's different in a way that we are actually doing what a lot of people talk about, and that is being inclusive of the entirety of our community, particularly when we know that 1 in 4 Illinoisans, 4 million Illinoisans right now, is walking around with a record or a conviction. And so having these folks at the table, because they represent about a quarter of the population, it's important to have their voices at the table. And so I'm excited that we were able to, to think through this concept and how it could work, because all this just started as an idea.
Yeah.
But to actually see it come to fruition in policy, it's incredibly exciting.
Yeah. I was reading an article this morning in Forbes that I'm sure you've seen about the difficulties New York and New Jersey have had in legislative legalization programs. And it was a columnist who said that Illinois managed to make them look like a joke by getting this done in one session with some hard work. But
I think the word that they used was dork.
Dork. There you go. I'm familiar.
Familiar with the article.
Yeah. And the expression.
Yes. I cracked up when I saw that yesterday.
Now these are a combination of state programs and aid to local programs that are working on this. So in looking at areas around Peoria, because we have some communities here that are very clearly hard hit with disinvestment, what are some of those programs that you would look toward and maybe counsel them look at getting in this program, or some things that are being done now that you think can be amped up? So
I would say folks that are doing work on the ground, like you have folks who have been doing a lot of work for any number of years, your PCCEOs, your urban leagues, your boys and girls clubs, organizations like that have been around years and years and years. But you also have some really good local groups that may not be sort of in that grant space, but they're also putting in the work, like folks like Change Peoria, Black Justice Project. Like those are organizations that are putting in work on the ground. And I think it's important to identify and lift up both, right? You need those more seasoned organizations that have been doing this work for a long time, but you also need those organizations that have that new energy and they're really getting after it, and they're getting to many of the ills that we're facing in our community, and they're challenging it. And if we collectively embrace the entirety of our community, it makes us better.
How do we measure the success of these programs? Because we're talking about, as you said, an awful lot of money, $125 million annually you're projecting for this. How do we measure what success looks like after 3 or 5 or 10 years?
So what we're doing is we've discussed sort of what that is. That also came into conversation as it related to how we would even manage it. I mean, there were folks who shall remain nameless who felt like this was something that should only go on for 2 years. And I said, that's a gimmick. That's not real. That's not real and true community reinvestment. If we're going to do something for 20 years and we're doing it under the auspices that these communities, these disproportionately impacted areas, have been marginalized and divested in for 80 years, to do that for 2 years only isn't real, and I don't want any part of it. But that's not what we're doing. So we're likely going to end up doing a look back 4 to 5 years from now to ensure that we are making inroads and we're actually making dents in the real issues that we're facing. One of the other issues that was paramount was also how do we craft the areas, right? So looking at legal aid, housing, communities impacted by violence prevention programs. We wanted to give autonomy to allow folks that regardless of what the issues are of that community and whatever the most pressing issues are, give communities the ability to have the autonomy to do what they need for their community, but also wanting to direct those resources so that when we're looking back at, so these are the activities, these are the organizations that we funded under economic development work. These are the organizations that we funded under violence prevention, and then go back and look at the data.
Okay.
Right? Look at data trends in those areas. What are the things, what are the tangible, noticeable things and the changes that have happened in those communities over this period of time? And you have to give communities time to, one, understand this process, two, to really be able to implement local strategies with fidelity. And so that takes, 3 to 5 years before you can see any real data changes. And so I look forward to that. My hope, my goal, our aspiration in doing this is that we believe that the wisdom is already in the room, that people that need to be there are already in some way, shape, form, or fashion already at the table. Oftentimes they just need the power and the resources and the sort of the convening that we will be able to do through R3 to bring best practices along to get the result that we want to see in communities. For example, as you know, a lot of the work that our office has been doing around the area of expungement, this is not an area that is new, but it takes someone to sort of step into this, to step into that space. Oftentimes there are, folks who could be doing expungement, but they don't have the resources to do, large scale expungements in that way. They require resources. So for example, with this policy measure, there potentially could be much more large scale expungement being done above and beyond the cannabis space, right? Because, as you know, we are expunging over 770,000 convictions as a result of this one policy. That was another very important issue for me. As you know, like I said, we've done expungement summits over the last 3 years in this district. And it was very interesting, like around the same time that I started working on this policy with Representative Cassidy in the House, was around the same time I was working on the expungement summits and getting that first summit up and going. And there's something to be said about when you're walking in what you feel like your purpose is, and things begin, God sort of unveils things before you. And I really felt like that. And I say that to say, during our first expungement summit, I saw men and women, grown men and women in their 50s and 60s weeping, weeping because they felt like they had a new lease on life. They felt like there was a 78-year-old man who could barely talk. And they said, if something like this would have happened for me 40, 50 years ago, I would have had a different life, and my children would have had a different life. Right. And all the work that we do, the goal is always to do the most good. And you pass, we work on bills, we pass legislation, but very rarely do you get to see how the policy impacts the person on the ground, like you do with expungement. And to know that through this policy, there will be hundreds of thousands of those folks that I'll never see, that I'll never experience. But we know that as a result of this policy, their lives are going to be changed, and their children's lives are going to be changed, because what we know from the data is that when you have a conviction, you're calcified in poverty. Right. Yeah, you're not making more than $10 an hour. You're condemned to a low-wage job, which affects where you live, where your kids can go to school, what you can eat. The number one data point that schools and education leaders look at as it relates to how successful a child is going to be in school is the wage that their family earns, their mother or father or their guardian earns. So when we know that folks are adults, parents are calcified in poverty, we are also subjecting their children to that same life. And so knowing that we will have the ability to literally impact hundreds of thousands of people with this policy through an automatic expungement process, that was critically important to us. negotiating this bill, because what we know is that even when you make changes to expungement policy or expanding it as we have in the last few years, what we know from data is that only about 3 to 5% of the population actually access that expungement relief. And so when we think about who those 3 to 5% are, again, we're not getting to the very people by which we are trying to change this law in order to help better their lives. And so going through this automatic expungement process, working with the state police who were at the table negotiating the entire time, who clearly is committed to doing this work in a very real way. Director Brendan Riley's, he's also, it's amazing because he's a former St. Clair County prosecutor, right? I mean, what better person could you have running the state police now? He used to be a part of expungement summits, right? And so in his own county, and so he gets it. Having someone like that leading the state police, knowing the critical role that the state police are gonna play in terms of identifying the network of individuals that are going to qualify for this.
Right. And as I understand the process, the state police identify those people who are eligible, ones who have misdemeanor or down to class 4 felony convictions are eligible. Then those lists go to the state's attorneys in the counties that those people live in. Then the state's attorneys are able to say yes, or we still got a problem. And then that list goes to the Prisoner Review Board, which says okie dokie, and moves it on to the governor, who signs the expungements, right?
So the state's attorneys will not have the ability to challenge expungements under 30 grams.
Okay.
Those will go directly. They will touch the process, but they won't be able to. They won't be able to object. Those will go directly to PRB. Where they will be able to object are those folks. So 2.5 years ago, we decriminalized up to 500 grams.
Right.
So up to 30 grams, up until 2.5 years ago, that was considered a felony. So we have about a 2.5-year window of folks who fall in that 30 grams to 500, more than 30 grams, but under 500 grams category as being where you would get your felony. But for the most part, folks, up until 2.5 years ago, you were getting a felony for 2.5, up until 2.5 years ago, you were getting a felony for anything above 30 grams. And so there are a lot of folks sort of many more folks in that window than in the over 30, under 500. But that over 30, above 500, up to 500, state's attorneys will have the ability to weigh in on those cases.
What is that weighing in on? And here's why I ask. You and I have talked before that there have been some concerns with some of the expungement processes so far, where you've got everybody qualifies. They've kept their nose clean. They haven't had other legal problems. They've been good citizens. But there have been state's attorneys or other county officials who said, well, wait a minute. They still have some court fees to pay. We're not going to get rid of this conviction until their court fees are taken care of. Is that a concern here?
I would say that, if they want, everybody's watching, right? So I'll just leave it like everyone is watching. And what we can't have is a state where you have massive disparities as it relates to who's able to get relief. That those individuals that I sort of laid out above 30, under 500, the majority of those are also in Cook. And in Cook, you have State's Attorney Fox, you have Chief Judge Tim Evans, as well as Clerk Brown, and so your clerks, your state's attorneys, and your chief judges, they're all going to play very, very critical roles in what this looks like. Right. When court will be who's objected to, who's not objected to, and so I would say that in a way, much more so in a way than like maybe some local person deciding to do an expungement summit, the eyes of the state are going to be on counties. Because clearly the intent of the law, and there, as you know, at one point, there was conversation around whether or not this policy was constitutional.
Right.
And
you made changes to reflect.
We did our work. We wanted to make sure, so we sat down with we sat down with stakeholders, local guy, Matt Jones, who is the executive director of the State Attorneys Association, and he sat down and thoroughly went through, like, here are the issues with the bill. And I'm telling you, he was very clear, as Matt is.
Very thorough.
Very thorough. Like, these are the problems with the bill. If you continue down this road, here are probably a couple things that'll happen. And so he wasn't the only actor, right, at the table that was saying that. And we took it seriously. And we wanted this to be, we didn't just want to talk to people who agreed with us. We wanted to talk to folks that disagreed. Whether or not they ever became a supporter of this policy, we thought that their voices at the table were important. Oftentimes, when you're negotiating something, it's just one big echo chamber of people who all think the same thing, and then you work out some policy without dissenting voices at the table. That definitely wasn't this. So we were able to ensure that the expungement policy was done in a way that was, one, constitutional, and two, in a way that should have similar impact all over the state. And so, again, to your point, you cannot legislate everything in a bill. So that's one of those pieces that people will be watching.
Yeah, and I presume people will also be speaking out over the next 6 months or a year if they see some inequality there or an issue in one of these counties that somebody is being entirely too literal on everything.
I would agree with that. This is, not just citizens in the state of Illinois. The reality of it is we just indicated Forbes, like, the world is watching. The world is watching to see what this looks like. And one of the things that I said continuously throughout this process, and particularly when we ran the bill, I sort of closed on this. This is not the beginning, or this is not the ending. This is just the beginning of the work that has to be done in this space. We're going to have to continue, my guess, like most other things that we work on, we're going to have to continue to work on tweaks, changes over the years. Think about this for a second. Alcohol was legalized in 1928. I don't remember a year since I've been in the Illinois General Assembly.
There's always some bill.
There's always some bill dealing with the issue of alcohol. We are literally from 1928 until there was a craft brewer bill that came through the GA this year, 80 some odd years later. And so the work is just beginning in this space, not just around legalization from the standpoint of the industry, but the community investment opportunities, the equity space, as well as the justice reform. We are going to have to continue to work and ensure that justice is not just for a few, but for the many.
And the equity issue is something that's been particularly big for you in this last legislative session. You've worked on material related to that, dealing with other elements that got worked into the budget and into the capital budget, into the marijuana legislation on requiring minority participation in the industry itself, opening the door for participation by people in those hard-hit communities. Talk about that, and then talk about some of the other budget and capital bill equity elements.
What I would say is specifically talking about the issue of cannabis legalization. You can't create an industry where wealthy men in suits carrying briefcases are going to get incredibly rich. And at the same time, you either have people facing convictions or in jail for those things, for that same activity. And you can't create an industry that isn't reflective of the entirety of the community. So you can't we would not be doing our jobs if we codified into law that basically the rich people who typically get rich in these spaces can continue to get rich while other folks only get, which is not small by any stretch of the imagination, while other communities only get expungement. That too would be inequitable. So we have to be talking about essentially what the three pillars of this bill: community reinvestment, criminal justice reform, but also real equity in the bill. So if you look at the medical industry, medical in Illinois is viewed as the gold standard around the country as it relates to medical, believe it or not. I see the chuckle.
There's some things Illinois can do okay.
Hey, listen, and this is one of them too. But in the medical industry, we are considered the gold standard. The way, and what that means is the way that we regulate medical. What you don't see coming out of Illinois and that you don't see in other states is you don't see a bunch of leakage from our cannabis industry, and that's really how that's how folks in the industry sort of determine success. Do you see leakage of that product in other states? In Illinois, we are one of 33 states that has a medical program. So when you think about that for a moment, right, you take a step back, people should know we're not. Maybe 10 years ago, we would really be stepping out on a limb with this cannabis legalization, but 33 states have some form of legalization through medical. We're the 11th state to do it through recreation. So when you look at the medical industry that exists in almost all states, or at least a third of the state, more than two-thirds of the states, and we are the gold standard for that as it relates to regulation. What we are not the gold standard in is diversity. And the diversity that did not happen in the medical industry is largely because we did not have an equity-centered conversation as it related to who would be participating in the sort of the economic largesse of cannabis, not just from a consumer perspective, but from the industry perspective. And
that pardon me for interrupting, that's both on the growing end and on the sales end, right?
Seed to sale. From seed to sale, what we centered in this policy is that there has to be equity from seed to sale. So from cultivation to dispensary, cultivation owners, dispensary owners, how many people, what your staff looks like, craft grows, infusers, security, transportation. So every single space within this policy had an equity lens on it, because that is the only, what I've learned through my time of being a policymaker. If you're not intentional about equity, it's not going to happen. It's not, right? And folks have great intentions, but the outgrowth of those intentions doesn't always translate. And so what we did with this policy is in order to make it not just lip service, we codified into the law that if you are a social equity applicant, meaning you are a person that comes from a disproportionately impacted area, DIAs are communities that have, you have numbers of high amounts of SNAP recipients, high amounts of individuals that are unemployed, communities that have seen disproportionate amounts of cannabis, not just arrests, but convictions, high amounts of returning citizens, folks that are returning to home from a time of incarceration. So we pulled out those communities. Obviously, Peoria would be one of those communities. Folks that social equity applicants coming from those disproportionately impacted areas would then have, and then if you have so here's the key, you as an applicant would be able to have to draw a nexus to that community, rather it be you or a family member that has been impacted by these things. You then would qualify as a social equity applicant. As a social equity applicant, you are going to get 20% of the core points as a social equity applicant. That's critical. Like you can't say, okay, only this community gets get the license. That's
Right.
That
and
would be
and
illegal.
in this case, it's not a guarantee that people get it, but it's an effort to level the playing field so that they can be competitive
Absolutely.
with the other applicants.
You are now incredibly competitive. And another applicant, okay, so say you're not a social equity applicant, people still have to have the ability to be able to actualize those points. And so you have to show that your staff is going to be diverse,
Right.
And not just diverse. Your staff would then need to come from some of those disproportionately impacted areas. So without being specific to race, we were able to get to the fact that there are so many people that come from communities that have been ravaged by the war on drugs. And if we created a policy that is not with intentionality pulling those folks into this industry, we would not be doing our jobs. That's one piece of it. Another really important component of having an equity-centered policy was that in the medical industry, one of the things that folks had to do was you had to be able to have your real estate in advance of the application. So again, what you're saying is only the wealthy should apply.
There's an economic level to that.
And so if you have to go and acquire significant real estate to be able to then apply, what you're saying is unless you're incredibly wealthy and you can go out and you can risk your financial life, don't apply. And so what we're saying with this policy is, no, we want the best people. And the best people aren't always the people who are incredibly wealthy. We want to make this an open process. That was when talking to entrepreneurs around the country, like that was a huge barrier. Another barrier that we learned from, again, traveling around the country, talking to these entrepreneurs, particularly minority entrepreneurs, is that folks would have a difficult time accessing capital. So I had a cannabis banking bill this year to deal with the fact that because cannabis is still considered a Schedule I drug federally, that it becomes very hard to bank and to bank your proceeds with this business. And so, working with the treasurer's office, we were able to open up the banking space for folks to be able to bank with the treasurer, and then also credit unions are stepping up. Credit Union One stepping up in a big way, saying, hey, we'll bank with you. They see that it's only a matter of time before this comes off of Schedule I federally. But specifically as it relates to capital, that was a bit of a sidebar, but we have put forth a $30 million cannabis investment fund that social equity applicants will have the ability to access to be able to offset half of the startup costs as it relates to licensure, as it relates to getting started with this industry. It's a hybrid program, part grant, part low interest loans. Again, looking to what were the areas that, good entrepreneurs who have awesome ideas, awesome business plans,
but have a capital barrier can't.
Absolutely. Capital barrier, real estate barrier. Those were two of the bigger issues that came up. We're centering social equity in the application process. So when you add all of that, when you look at the social equity applicant points, the $30 million revolving loan fund, when you look at how that's going to offset costs of the application, how you can access this low interest revolving loan fund for building out your business, those are incredibly important steps that we're taking to say, hey, we're serious. We're not just talking equity, but we're serious about it. And we're putting our money where our mouth is. And so those dollars were seeded. So those dollars were seeded from funds that came out of the medical industry. So that's where I think a couple of folks had questions in the past. Well, where did that money come from? That money came from the individuals there's a fund that the medical industry has been funding for the last few years. That's where those dollars came from. So it isn't like taxpayer.
Not new money.
It's not new money. It's not taxpayer money.
Right.
It is money specifically from the medical industry.
Okay. Good. Now, I want to close with this.
We're done already?
We're coming up on a half hour here, I think. NPR Illinois did a feature on you and Representative Cassidy and Senators Staines and Hutchinson. They called you guys the marijuana moms.
Yeah.
And there's really something there, I think, about 4 very involved, savvy female legislators working this bill at different stages themselves of parenthood in different communities, sort of seeing things from different lenses, all of whom are friends throughout this process. Talk about that story and sort of your experience working with those other 3 women on the bill.
First off, we are definitely girl gang. But we started this process, one, friends, which, and when you're friends with someone, it makes it easier to have the difficult conversations. When talking about criminal justice, community reinvestment, equity, and why that's important. The upside is we didn't have to say, hey, here's why equity is important, right? I mean, it'd be hard for me to be friends with somebody that I have to explain why equity is important. They got that. What was helpful for me and for Senator Hutchinson was having friends that when there were issues, and there were always issues, explaining the why, or why something wasn't going to work, or why something didn't feel the way that this should feel. When you're friends, those conversations can happen much easier, and you don't have to worry about people getting their feelings hurt. We had a lot of those tough conversations along the way.
And you ended as friends.
And we ended as much better friends than we even started. And we were really good friends to start this off. But those 3 women they will always be incredibly special to me for different reasons. We share the fact that all of us have children. Of the crew, I have the youngest, the little one. I have a 4-year-old. I think the oldest, Heather has a child who's almost 30. So we're talking about children from
Broad
the
range.
ages, from 4 to 30, teenagers, baby adults who are doing adult things, but calling mom and dad for money every day.
Which is part of this, because you guys set a 21 age limit on this,
yes.
and you're looking at some of those things on what are kids going to experience in high school on these issues? What
was incredibly interesting was, I remember having this conversation about, not wanting to send the wrong message, right? Yeah. And the reality of it is that as we're talking as moms, if there was ever anyone that wants to protect your family and protect your children, it's their moms. And there's no better way than to protect your children than to put government right there in the middle, right? And so right now, kids can get access to marijuana easier than they can get access to how to do almost anything else. Like there's no shortage of marijuana if kids want to get their hands on it. But what we're doing by taxing and regulating it, it is going to be far more difficult. Youth use has gone down in all the states that have legalized because the illicit market is completely driven out. If they do it in the right way, if they don't overtax, there's no reason for there to be an illicit market anymore. And so once there's no longer an illicit market, your kid's not going to be able to get into a dispensary with a fake ID. It's not going to happen. So the ability to just be able to get, marijuana off the street, or however people get what they get, those opportunities will be vastly dissipated. And so for me as a parent who knows that it's important to have real conversations about what cannabis is and what it isn't, right now cannabis is a Schedule I drug. So we're saying cannabis is the same thing as heroin. Well, any kid that knows much is going to tell you they're not the same thing, though. And what we have the ability to do is, because of this policy, we're on and this was a very, as much as equity, it was incredibly important for us to make sure that there was money in the bill to do a vast public education campaign, the same way that they did with cigarettes, the same way that they've done with alcohol, to try to prevent youth use. The only group where you see a vast expansion of usage is those folks between the ages of 55 and 70.
I thought that was interesting that we're seeing more older adults into senior citizens who are choosing to use now.
That's where the big growth is, right? So your AARP crew, your Senior Citizen Gold Club clan, those are the folks that are, by and large, when we're legalizing, those are the folks that are running to the dispensaries. It isn't kids. And so that was important for all of us, right? That we are seeing youth use go down, and particularly living here in Peoria over the years and seeing literally people become incredibly ill, even a few folks lose their lives participating in this off-brand K2 synthetic marijuana space. And that happened during the midst of this conversation. It was incredibly powerful and informing, again, as a mom who doesn't want to see that happen, certainly not to my child and not to anyone's child. And so if we don't want to see that happening, we have to regulate this industry. It's not going anywhere. You have the whole country of Canada sitting on top of us. That is entirely legal. 10 states across the country that have gone recreational.
With a few others in the pipeline still.
With a few others in the pipeline. And I hope that they look at Illinois as a model. That's what I'm hearing from the word on the legislative streets throughout the country is that Illinois is going to be used as a model as it relates to not just how you put a paragraph on a ballot and the people say yes or no, but actually how you do it, how you implement this policy, how it impacts people, how it impacts communities, and the good that you can do as a result of this policy. I know the state of California did it through ballot measure, and then they tried to come back around and do some of the equity-centered things, do some of the criminal justice things, do some of the public education stuff that we're going to be doing. But once the industry's already created, the cake's already baked. Right. And so it's hard to come back and unwind some of those things. So, we're only the second country in the nation that's done it through the legislative process. The only other state that did it through the legislative process was Vermont. Vermont is incredibly homogenous, so they don't have to do the things that we have to do in this melting pot that we call Illinois when we want to be inclusive.
All right. Excellent. Well, Jehan Gordon-Booth, thank you very much for coming in, and we'll look forward to seeing how this rolls out over the first 6 months here on the expungements, and then after legalization on January 1st.
Thank you. I appreciate, I appreciate you taking the time and having interest in this issue, but I also want to say an extra special thank you to you and to the PJ Star for looking at this issue as though we were in 2019, right? And not like 1952. I cannot tell you how proud that makes me coming from Peoria, knowing that we have folks at the table who are talking about this in a real way, the impact that it has on folks, particularly those that come from disproportionately impacted areas, Black and brown communities that have been completely left behind in some regards, and the work that you all have done to highlight the issues of disparities, because the only way to heal the wounds that exist is we have to stop concealing them. We have to stop pretending like they don't exist, and we have to put the dead fish on the table and deal with it. And so I want to thank you for and the paper for using your platform to highlight some very real issues that if it weren't for the fact that you guys have leaned into this work, it would make the work that I'm trying to do so much harder. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And we're going to keep trying to cover those things in the months and years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.